Blase produces, above all, Art Zone. Gravediggers.
Hello.
Hey folks, we're here.
We are back.
Yeah, it's the last week of June and we're back. I hope everyone's having a good and safe summer.
Definitely. We do have some exciting episodes on the way, but they're in the research phase. Today's case is pretty straightforward, with very few good guys. Very cringe.
Yeah, it's an absurdist case, so there's no heroes for us to support.
We want to just give you guys a heads up. The subject of today's episode, George Wallace, is exceptionally racist, so we're going to discuss racism. We would never repeat racial slurs or anything like that, but we will acknowledge some of the horrific things this man said and supported. We just want you to know as we go into it, we could never, not talk about it.
Yeah.
At his inaugural address in 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace infamously declared, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." An avowed racist, he opposed the civil rights movement and its mission to end legalized racial discrimination in the United States. To label him a controversial figure would be an injustice to the people he hated and devoted his political career to oppressing. According to the Detroit News, Wallace feared an attempt on his life. He's quoted as saying, quote, "Somebody's going to get me one of these days. I can just see a little guy out there that nobody's paying attention to. He reaches into his pocket and out comes the little gun, like that Sirhan guy that got Robert Kennedy." End quote.
Yeah, just to refer to that, Sirhan was a Palestinian Christian man who shot and killed Robert Kennedy in 1968, ostensibly because of Kennedy's support for Israel during the 1967 war. He received a death sentence that was commuted to life in prison and remains behind bar to this day. He had 15 parole applications that were all rejected, allegedly because he hasn't shown enough remorse or something like that. I think we should make an episode on that at some point. It's a very interesting case.
It's on the list for sure. Will require a ton of research though.
Oh yeah, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories with that one as well.
Sirhan is a really funny name. In Arabic too. It means stare into the distance.
Yeah, to stare into the distance. Yeah, it's to daydream or something.
Indeed, some little guy did get George Wallace. Or at least he tried. On Monday, May 15th, 1972, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, Arthur Herman Bremer fired at George Wallace 5 times at point-blank range. Though seriously injured, Wallace survived the attack. But why did Bremer fire on the governor? Was this a political statement, or was it something else entirely? So let's first discuss the lifetimes and politics of George Wallace. Born August 25th, 1919, he was 52 years old at the time of the shooting. He was raised in Barber County in southeastern Alabama, and went to Alabama School of Law immediately after high school and received a Bachelor of Laws in 1942. Now, a Bachelor of Laws degree is still relevant in places like the UK, but it's been pretty much completely phased out in the US. Most states, including Alabama, now require potential attorneys to have a Juris Doctor to sit the bar exam. It's interesting how lots of these requirements are relatively new, because not so long ago, you could take most state bar exams with just a bachelor's degree, and before that, potential lawyers had to study under a brief apprenticeship and then give an oral examination before a judge. It's a prime example of how higher education has become a necessary commodity to earn admittance into generally higher-paying professions and maintain a class hierarchy disguised as meritocracy.
I agree. I mean, it's the same things with medicine and pharmacy. In the UK, medicine is an undergrad program. Whereas in the US and here in Canada, it's not only becoming a postgrad program, but it's so limited, so exclusive in terms of applying to enter, that applicants are almost expected, not on paper, but de facto expected to have a master's in addition to their undergrad bachelor's degree in order to be accepted. In addition to maintaining the class hierarchy, it creates this artificial limit to the labor pool of, MDs and JDs. and it inflates their salaries, but at the same time, it creates these overworked workers. There's definitely a shortage of doctors, at least, that could easily be eased with more doctors being allowed into school, but it's not happening.
Yeah, and also, I totally agree that to be a doctor or a pharmacist or an attorney or something, you should have a firm education. But here in the States, to get a bachelor's degree, you have to do all these gen eds. Like, I took fucking rock science in university, and my degree is in political science, Middle East studies, and sociology.
Yeah, it's weird, but it's also a downstream symptom of the weakness of American public education in terms of like high school and stuff. If there was a more robust secondary school system, then students would be much more prepared to enter programs like medicine as undergrads.
True. I took a puppets class in university and I got an A minus. It's my greatest shame.
A what class?
A puppet class.
Is that like do you learn how to do puppetry?
Yes.
Or is it like
We built these giant puppets.
oh wow, okay.
Yeah, but it was not held at the university. It was held downtown in this man's puppet lair.
That is disturbing.
Yeah. So from 1943 to 1945, Wallace serves in the U.S. Army Air Force. He was part of a crew that conducted air raids on Japan. He was discharged on medical grounds in mid-1945 due to severe anxiety. In 1946, Wallace wins election to the Alabama House of Representatives and serves as a state judge. In 1958, he seeks the Democratic nomination in the gubernatorial election, but loses. In 1962, he runs for governor again and adopts a more, quote, hardline segregationist stance, end quote. That is, he runs as a loud, proud racist. He tried to stop the racial integration of the University of Alabama by literally standing in front of the entrance and blocking the path of 2 Black students. President Kennedy had to call the National Guard. This is disgusting enough, but what's so horrific and revealing about the United States is that it worked. Wallace gained popularity and won the gubernatorial race. So we kind of have to dip into who the Southern Democrats are, because George Wallace was what we call a Southern Democrat. It might surprise some of our listeners that the Democratic Party held a firm grip on the American Southeast until a schism in the party in the 1950s and 60s over desegregation. If you're not from the US and you're very unfamiliar with segregation and desegregation, segregation refers to separating everything from drinking fountains to cinemas to schools by race through a set of laws known as Jim Crow laws.
Segregationists actually defend this system by claiming that segregation must be, quote, separate but equal, end quote. Of course, the reality is totally different. White facilities were much better and well-maintained than their colored counterparts, if any of the latter were even made available, because in many cases, they just weren't.
Following the U.S. Civil War and abolition of chattel slavery, Jim Crow laws were one way to keep white supremacy alive and well in the United States. I say one way because other mechanisms of white supremacy, from the carceral system to the theft and exploitation of indigenous lands, still exist mainly in the same forms they have for centuries now. One goal of the civil rights movement, led by Black organizers in the 1950s and 60s, was desegregation, an end to Jim Crow laws, and a legal mandate barring racial discrimination. Due to tireless protests by these activists, many of these blatantly discriminatory laws were overturned, and President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and Voting Rights Act in 1965. Though racial segregation is now legally banned in the United States, it still exists in practice. Cities like Detroit and Chicago are significantly segregated by race due to a century of redlining, or the systematic denial of housing loans to Black people. This isn't just a Southern problem, it's in every major American city.
Yeah, funnily enough, this goes back to the end of World War II when a GI Bill allowed for a large suite of benefits to war veterans, to Army veterans, including, low-cost mortgages. But in practice, this strongly favored white veterans because what ended up happening is the benefits of the GI Bill were only available to those vets who were honorably discharged, and a disproportionate number of Black veterans were either dishonorably discharged or received blue discharges, which were neutral. They weren't either honorably or dishonorably discharged. And in both cases, that makes them ineligible for those mortgages and other GI Bill benefits, including tuition grants and loans for universities. So even those that were eligible for their benefits, that were honorably discharged, end up facing an array of roadblocks that ultimately restricted them from getting mortgages and thus flourishing in the post-war American society that you see in movies, the sort of, Americana type fantasies.
I'd say definitely in the US, at least when we were younger, we were taught racism existed and it was very bad. And then Martin Luther King Jr. came and everyone lifted him up and celebrated him. And now there's no more racism. Yay, we did it.
Yeah, it's funny because if you actually look at the polling in the era, Martin Luther King never went past 35% approval among non-Black people, among white Americans. So it wasn't so much everyone loved him and lifted him up on their shoulders as, him trying to drag America kicking and screaming into some semblance of a fair society. And even then, the FBI ended up assassinating him, so...
I mean, to give just one example of how racism is alive and well, Black people are majorly overrepresented in the prison population. Native and Latino people are also slightly overrepresented, and white people are extremely underrepresented. So here's a shocking fact. Wilcox County High School in Georgia held its first desegregated prom in 2013. If you're wondering how the fuck did that happen, many high schools got away with holding segregated proms by having the parents organize and sponsor them as private invitation-only parties instead of school-sponsored events where everyone in the class can buy a ticket. So the parents plan this private party and then don't invite the Black kids. What the fuck? I want to read a quote from the New York Times on the 2013 prom desegregation because I think it really sums up the sort of I'm not racist, but attitude that these people have. Quote, "Locally, the separate proms have defenders. White residents said members of the two races had different tastes in music and dancing. Wayne McGinty, a furniture store owner and city council member who is white, said he had donated to fundraising events for both proms in past years and saw no problem with separate proms. They do not reflect racism, he said, but simply different traditions and tastes. When he was a senior in high school, in the 1970s, he said, there were separate proms for those who liked rock music and country music. This whole issue has been blown out of proportion, he said. Nobody had a problem with having two proms until it got all this publicity. Parents who organized the white prom declined to comment, as did the students who attended." End quote. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. It's not racist to have racially segregated proms because Black kids and white kids have different music tastes. Do you even hear yourselves?
I love it. It's okay to have a normal prom and then a prom for rap type people who listen to, communist satanic music that isn't biblically ordained.
It's so obvious. And also, Wayne says nobody had a problem with having two proms until it got all this publicity. The Black students have a problem with it. The article literally begins with a Black student named Marisha Rucker discussing her frustration with the racism of white prom, saying, quote, "These are people I see in class every day. What's wrong with dancing with me just because I have more pigment?" End quote. I just think this really sums up how people will say the most blatantly racist things and then say, I'm not racist. I don't know if this person genuinely thinks what he's saying is not racist or if he, why would he give this quote to the New York Times?
I don't know. I mean, maybe he thinks that the part where he says he donated to both proms makes him look good. I don't know.
Right. And I do think we have to look at how a lot of racism is institutional. It's not just individual people thinking that they are racially superior to others.
Yeah.
However, those people exist.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So getting back to the Southern Democrats, though Johnson himself was a Democrat from Texas, he pissed off members of his own party, like George Wallace, when he signed the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. George Wallace ran on a platform of racial segregation. According to those who knew him, he also personally detested Black people. From Wikipedia, quote, Wallace's preoccupation with race was based on his belief that Black people comprised a separate and inferior race, end quote. So pretty much the definition of hardcore racist bigotry.
Not to get too into the weeds on this, but the Democratic Party being portrayed as the party of progressives, as we see it today, is a relatively new thing. So during the Civil War, the Democrats were the party of the South, whereas the very new Republican Party represented abolitionism in its various forms, from the sort of mild abolitionism of Abraham Lincoln to the hardcore militant abolitionism of Thaddeus Stevens. Following the Civil War, all white Democrat legislatures in the South basically ended up erecting and maintaining Jim Crow. And things changed slowly at first, but it came at a head in 1948 when Democrat President Harry S. Truman signed a bill that desegregated the US military, which ironically up until that point was segregated. Consequently, a group of Southern Democrats called Dixiecrats split from the party and they chose to run Senator Strom Thurmond for president in 1948. Thurmond is another, out and out segregationist, militant racist, much like Wallace. The Dixiecrats lost as a spoiling third party, and their faction soon dissolved, but the rift was there. In the 60s, Democrat Lyndon Johnson, as Aaron just said, signed a civil rights bill, which basically angered these conservative Democrats even more. And Strom Thurmond became one of the first Democrats to jump ship and join the Republican Party. The reason he did that was because many of these segregationists were attracted to the presidential campaign of a Republican, Barry Goldwater, who was notoriously segregationist as well. In 1964, Johnson easily beats Goldwater in the presidential elections. But in 1968, Richard Nixon, another Republican, sees the opportunity and basically leads a strong top-down effort by the Republican Party to penetrate the South, largely by echoing racial grievances and anti-civil rights sentiment and playing to, the sort of latent misanthropy of racist whites in the South. And he succeeded. He won the election in 68. And Ronald Reagan, then consolidated this shift during his run in 1980 by appealing to the racist and to the evangelical right, basically shifting the Republicans to the ultra-conservative party they are today. And the Democrats basically occupied the vacuum of the civil rights, sort of the New Deal and the Great Society type party, and now the party of the progressive side in the culture wars.
If you're new to this podcast, we both rail on the Democrats and the Republicans.
Oh yeah, I despise the Democrats as much as the Republicans, honestly.
At the time of the assassination attempt in 1972, George Wallace was running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, now declaring that he had, quote, always been a moderate on racial matters, end quote. Now keep in mind, this is after the segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever bit. What the fuck is a moderate on racial matters? There is no middle ground on racism. Either you are racist or you are anti-racist. I detest this enlightened centrism shit they're trying to pull, and fuck every liberal who falls for it. We see you and we know exactly what you're doing. Now let's talk about our shooter, Arthur Herman Bremer. He was born August 21st, 1950, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Go Bucks. He's from a working-class family and apparently had no friends in high school and was ostracized by his peers. After high school graduation, he briefly attended Milwaukee Area Technical College, but left after one semester. In 1971, Arthur is demoted from being a busboy to kitchen staff at the Milwaukee Athletic Club after patrons complained about him talking to himself. PBS describes Bremer as having a, quote, bent toward pornography, guns, and suicide, end quote. Not an ideal combination, I would say. Maybe get yourself a bent toward, candle making or something. Around Thanksgiving in 1971, Bremer, now 21 years old, meets 15-year-old Joan Pemrich and becomes fixated on her. But she breaks off their relationship, citing Bremer as, quote, goofy and weird, end quote. Fucking ouch, but also she's right, and she should run away as fast as she can.
Yeah, goofy here is not used in an endearing manner.
Bremer stalked Joan for a time, even shaving his head, quote, to show her that inside I felt as empty as my shaved head, end quote. What the fuck?
That doesn't even make any sense. Even from a poetic perspective, that is just dumb.
Yeah. So I think all of our listeners can see where this is going. On January 13th, 1972, Bremer decides he's going to try to kill George Wallace. Why? We don't know exactly. but he wrote in his diary, quote, "Now I start my diary of my personal plot to kill by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace, to do something bold and dramatic, forceful and dynamic, a statement of my manhood for the world to see." End quote. So he's like an incel. The same day, Bremer buys a .38 for $80 at Casanova Guns in Milwaukee.
It's interesting that he's debating between Nixon and Wallace. Like, if he's torn between candidates of the '68 election, why not Hubert Humphrey?
Yeah, his choices are interesting. I'd say it has nothing to do with party.
Oh, it's not political at all, I think.
Yeah. So in 1972, Bremer nearly shoots himself in a hotel room when he accidentally discharges a gun he was planning to use to assassinate Richard Nixon. So this guy just wants to shoot a president or presidential candidate. Nixon was a Republican and Wallace was a Democrat, so again, I don't think it really had anything to do with their politics. As the sitting president, Nixon would have much better security than George Wallace, making Wallace the easier target. So I think his reason for targeting Wallace was just sort of practical, and he was a nationally known figure because of all the racist shit he said. Having no sexual experience, Bremer allegedly tried to hire a sex worker before he shot Wallace, maybe to have sex before inevitably going to prison. But for some reason, it didn't work or he didn't go through with it. Oh, fuck off, Holden Caulfield. Bremer also tried to think up a cute phrase to shout when he shot Wallace, going for something like "Sic semper tyrannis," thus be it ever to tyrants, which is what John Wilkes Booth yelled when he shot Abraham Lincoln. Bremer settled on "a penny for your thoughts," but he never managed to get the words out when he fired the gun. A penny for your thoughts. This guy just gets worse and worse. Oh my fucking God. I hate him so much. What does that even mean in this circumstance? Fake deep in the 1970s. Fucking embarrassing for him.
He's very cringe. He's very like an Redditor type. But at the same time, it's funny because a penny for your thoughts, counting inflation, would probably translate to $5 for your thoughts in today's parlance.
It's also funny, he literally writes down, "I'm trying to come up with a cute phrase."
Yeah, it's dumb.
So on May 15th, 1972, it's hot and humid in Laurel, Maryland, where Wallace is giving a speech and shaking supporters' hands. So he decides to forego his usual bulletproof vest. At approximately 4 p.m., Bremer pushes through the crowd and fires a .38 caliber Charter Arms snub-nose several times. 4 shots hit Wallace. One hit Secret Service agent Nicholas Zarvos in the throat, another hit volunteer Dorothy Thompson in the right leg, and another still hit Alabama State Trooper Eldred C. Dothard in the stomach. Everyone survived.
If you're unfamiliar with .38 caliber guns, they're very small and easy to conceal, but the trade-off is that the small size of the caliber makes it very difficult to kill someone, even if you do get them. So, try a larger caliber, or better yet, coordinate with a second shooter on a grassy knoll somewhere to finish the job.
Just a warning, we're about to describe Wallace's physical injuries, and it gets pretty graphic. One bullet hit Wallace's spinal cord, damaging the 12th thoracic intercostal nerve, which controls feeling and movement on the right side of the body, below the waist. As a result, Wallace was paralyzed from the waist down, losing control of his legs, bowel, bladder, and sexual functioning until his death in 1998. Another bullet hit Wallace's stomach and large intestine. Though the shell was surgically removed, Wallace had not yet digested his lunch, so the bullet wound caused his food to spill into his abdominal cavity, resulting in several infections. Doctors were able to repair bullet wounds to Wallace's right arm, right shoulder, and left shoulder blade. Now, according to journalist Seymour Hersh, when Nixon heard of the assassination attempt, he tried to dispatch an aide, E. Howard Hunt, to break into Bremer's apartment in Milwaukee and plant campaign literature for Wallace's opponent, George McGovern. Hersh maintains that Hunt was unable to enter the apartment because the FBI had already gotten there and sealed it off. A 2007 analysis of the Nixon tapes didn't find evidence of Nixon authorizing a break-in, but what would a Das Criminal episode be without a reference to a Cy Hersh conspiracy?
But what if that's like the mythical 18 minutes that were deleted from the Nixon tapes? What if that's what they're about?
Maybe. Regardless, Nixon tried to spread a false rumor that Bremer was a McGovern supporter, presumably to besmirch his name and weaken a potential presidential rival. And this is ironic, of course, because Nixon is as dirty as they come. Bremer was apprehended at the scene by an angry crowd and the police. According to the New York Times, quote, some pummeling ensued, end quote, and Bremer had to receive treatment for head lacerations at Leland Hospital, so it sounds like they beat him up. Bremer was charged with 4 counts of assault with intent to murder, 4 counts of assault and battery, 4 counts of using a gun in a felony, and 1 count of illegally transporting a firearm into Maryland. He was held on $200,000 bond, which is nearly 1.3 million US dollars in today's money. He was represented by the ACLU, which is strange because I can't see how civil liberties are a factor in this case. The target was a politician, but the motive was infamy. I think Bremer more closely matches the profile of Mark David Chapman, who killed John Lennon, than, say, Patrick McGee, who planted the IRA bomb intended to blow up Margaret Thatcher and whose intentions were acutely political.
Yeah, I agree. I think this stinks of the John Hinckley type murder or assassination attempt on Reagan because he thought it would impress Jodie Foster or something. Much more crazy man yells at cloud than political assassination or campaign. As an aside, though, it is hilarious to me that Facebook wine moms basically took the IRA statement following the failed bomb to kill Thatcher, which was, quote, you have to be lucky every time. We only have to be lucky once, end quote, and basically slapped it onto a photo of Thatcher and now attributed what was an ominous threat towards Thatcher to her for some reason. I don't get it.
A lot of fake deep quotes coming up in this episode.
Oh, yeah.
The defense argued an insanity plea, saying that Bremer was schizophrenic, but the prosecution and chief psychiatrist asserted that he still knew what he was doing was wrong. So contrary to what Law & Order would have us believe, an insanity plea isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card for anyone with a mental illness. Counsel has to prove that the defendant didn't understand what they were doing, failed to know right from wrong, acted on an uncontrollable impulse, or some combination of these factors. A person who suffers from a psychological breakdown and maybe believes God is talking to them and telling them they had to kill someone is a good case for pleading insanity. However, it's worth noting that even if found not guilty by reason of insanity, defendants have to go to a state psychiatric hospital, which is, to some degree, also part of the carceral system. I'd imagine these places aren't fun to live. Bremer doesn't really meet any of the criteria for an insanity plea, since he planned the assassination attempt in detail and wrote that he was doing it to prove his manhood. I'd argue that anyone who feels driven to shoot someone because they were rejected by a 15-year-old girl has some serious mental issues, but that doesn't mean they're not responsible for the violence they commit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, first, insanity pleas simply mean, a jail term is avoided in exchange for a sentence at a carceral psychiatric facility, which is still, you're being incarcerated in a place. And secondly, again, Das Criminal recommends never writing down your thought process before committing a crime. We reiterated this 100 times on this podcast, but written documents are a surefire way of being convicted and found guilty. But on the flip side, it does make researching for this episode a lot easier.
On August 4th, 1972, a jury found Bremer guilty on all charges after deliberating for only 90 minutes. He was sentenced to 63 years in Maryland State Prison. While in prison, Bremer declined mental health evaluation and treatment. Wallace wrote to Bremer in 1995 expressing forgiveness, but Bremer didn't reply. George Wallace died on September 13th, 1998. Now, as a side note, I just want to point out that Wallace apparently became a born-again Christian and said he no longer adhered to these racist views, but that was after society had pretty much deemed those things unacceptable, so he used racism to advance his political career when it served him, and then when people were finally no longer having it, suddenly he becomes reformed. Fuck off. At his parole hearing in 1996, Bremer argued that, quote, shooting segregationist dinosaurs wasn't as bad as harming mainstream politicians, end quote. You got him, Artie.
I mean, where's the lie there?
Yeah. Bremer was released from prison in November 2007, so he has been out for nearly 14 years with little fanfare. His probation period ends in 2025, at which time he will be 75 years old. So, was this a political assassination attempt? I mean, sort of. George Wallace was a well-known politician for the worst reasons, but Bremer wasn't motivated by opposition to Wallace's politics. He was inspired by some twisted form of social isolation and misogyny, things that are political by nature but also take a back seat in this case. This is an irritating one because you learn what a piece of shit George Wallace was, and most of us would assume whoever shot him maybe had some righteous intentions, even though, of course, we don't condone violence on this podcast. But no, he's not angry about racism, he just hates women. Absolutely bizarre that a man can't get his dick wet, so he buys a gun and picks unrelated people to shoot. This is one case of many. Like, you also have men running people over in cars and just committing these wild acts of violence because they can't get laid.
Okay, but counterpoint, at least this psycho decided to shoot Wallace instead of Joan, the 15-year-old girl who rejected him. Like, obviously, we don't condone violence and don't shoot anyone because they're not having sex, because that's not good. But if these freaks had to shoot someone, I'd rather they go with the segregationist dinosaur, as he called them, over some poor innocent women or like completely unrelated women.
It's interesting because so many murders and violence are outlets for this sort of rage. Like, so many men who are serial killers have problems with their moms and their wives and like all the women that they know. So they just pick out random women, usually women that are vulnerable. So sex workers.
Yeah, stuff of that nature, yeah.
Right. It's just, get your shit together. Stop. Here's a not so fun fact. Bremer's diary was the main inspiration for Robert De Niro's character Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, and the film would later inspire John Hinckley Jr. to shoot President Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, that famous saying by Marx, history is first comes as farce and then as a bigger farce, because history really is a flat circle.
So true. So that is the story of the assassination attempt on George Wallace.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. That was fun.
Joan, wherever you are, honey, hope you're doing well.
Yeah, shout out to Joan. Hope you're doing well. Hope Artie isn't a freak anymore, but yeah.
So if you like our content, you can find us on Patreon at Das Criminal and get some bonus content. We're about to record a bonus episode about Toy Story 2, so if you're a fan, hop on over there. You can also find us on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod, and please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, for our Patreon subscribers, see you in a bit. For everyone else, until next time.
Bye.